sense of place for me represents being able to walk back in time, and that there is a connection between the past and the present. As we tour this historic neighborhood, you get a real sense of place. You see all of these historic markers, and it signals that this is where American history happened. It signals to the visitor that Black life and identity is important to understanding the full history of the state of Virginia and our nation. Places like the Ann Spencer House, Garden and Museum, it has a multiplicity of stories imbued within this historic asset and the landscape. It stands not only to tell the story of this Queen Anne-style house that her husband constructed with his own hands, but it also tells this remarkable American story that's often overlooked about Ann Spencer and her important life.
I think the Harlem Renaissance is one of the most important movements in American literature, if not American life. It really thinks about the origins of African American culture and takes pleasure in celebrating them. That comes from someone like Langston Hughes writing about the blues to something like Ann Spencer writing about the land and the earth and myth, and making all these things, I think, very present. Many of the poets were from lots of different places that they convened on Harlem, but the Harlem Renaissance took place as much in Paris and other parts of the world, Washington, D.C., where we're sitting now, as it did in Harlem. And I think that's really important to remember the ways that it was an international movement. I also think that it's a movement about movement. Much of what the Harlem Renaissance was interested in was migration and thinking about these different kinds of migration, whether it's Langston Hughes writing about up north blues or bound north blues, or you have people in the South writing about their Southern experiences, whether it was Sterling Brown or Ann Spencer. And I think that sort of beauty of place is really important to the Harlem Renaissance, but also the ugliness of place and trying to think about the tension between one's dreams and hopes, but also one's frustrations, the dream deferred that Langston Hughes eventually writes about in the 50s. But during the 20s, I think you really see this foment, this excitement.
Well, at the time Ann Spencer was developing her garden, there were a lot of things happening nationally. We have the pandemic of 1918. We have Black migration to the north. We have Black soldiers returning from World War I who are demanding their civil rights. The local chapter of the NAACP is formed right here in Ann Spencer's living room. But I think for understanding the context of the garden, the most important thing are the Jim Crow laws that are in effect all over the South.
Ann Spencer's husband, Edward, built the Spencer family home between 1903 and 1904. Spencer was 20 when they moved into the house. She had 2 young daughters. She spent her days caring for her children and gardening for many hours in the backyard. Spencer's garden is informed, I believe, by her classical education at Virginia Seminary, where she comes to learn about Epicurus and the idea of retreat from a corrupt society. We find her working in her garden and creating a more ideal space than that which she encounters on a daily basis in Lynchburg. And she will write about this. She'll talk about the way in which the daily assaults on a Black citizen of Lynchburg are like being lynched every day. And it makes the idea of this garden space as a retreat, but still a political choice, all the more powerful.
Ann Spencer is my grandmother, but most people know her as a poet or gardener. But she was also an advocate, librarian, mother to my father and my two aunts, Bethel and Alroy. And she was a person who cared about her community and people in her community. You know, she writes that this garden was half her world, and it really was half her world. She couldn't vote. She was a Black woman who was very vocal here in this city. She was concerned about education. She was concerned about equality. She used this garden as a place for her to come to escape to, but she also invited other people into this garden to maybe not the word escape, but to come and have freedom. She came to this cottage when she ended her day as librarian at Dunbar Branch Library. My mother says that my grandmother would come through the house, she'd put down her purse, and she'd go through the kitchen and she may get a little snack, come on down here to the garden, and this is where she would be until the end of the night, early into the morning. But she's writing here at this desk, she's writing poetry, she's writing letters to the editor, she is writing for some cause, but she takes a break very often and goes out into the garden. And I think that you see that in her poetry, you know, her love of nature and beauty, that she is inspired by out of these windows that she sees in her garden cottage.
I thought I'd read this poem by Ann Spencer, Sybil Warren's her sister. It appears in African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, an anthology I put together, and it's one of my favorites. Sybil Warren's her sister. It is dangerous for a woman to defy the gods, to taunt them with the tongue's thin tip, or strut in the weakness of mere humanity, or draw a line, daring them to cross. The gods who own the searing lightning, the drowning waters, the tormenting fears, the anger of red sins. Oh, but worse still if you mince along timidly, dodge this way or that, or kneel or pray, or be kind, or sweat agony drops, or lay your quick body over your feeble young. If you have beauty or plainness, if celibate or vowed, the gods are juggernaut passing over each of us. Or this you may do, lock your heart, then quietly, unless they peer within, light no lamp when the dark comes down, raise no shade for sun. Breathless must your breath come through, if you die and dare deny the gods their godlike fun.
Spencer is significant in a variety of ways to thinking through American poetry. The first is in thinking about the contributions of Black women poets. Spencer, among her peers, we find working through modernist ideas of what a modern Black subject looks like. And particularly in her later manuscript works, we find her developing her own Black aesthetic. She has these exquisite, tightly wrought poems from the 1920s. Those poems include something like Lines to a Nasturtium, Grapes, Still Life, even At the Carnival. And there's a compelling technique that's in those poems. There's a kind of key image at the start of it, but Spencer is not an imagist. She's taking that image and working it through almost the way an earthworm works through the soil, right, to lead to a greater fertility and illumination of what the subject is that she's talking about. But more extraordinary, perhaps, is Spencer's garden. It is a palpable experience with the poet herself. It's a place of the spirit. It is a space of growth and possibility. It's a space of mourning. It's not an agrarian garden, and I think it's important for us to note that this is a garden of expression, of beauty. It is something that feeds into the creation of her poems, and indeed, as Spencer writes, the garden space is a rarer and more transformative space than the poems themselves.
This poem is titled Earth, I Thank You by Anne Spencer. Earth, I thank you for the pleasure of your language. You've had a hard time bringing it to me, from the ground to the grunt, through the noun, to all the way feeling, seeing, smelling, touching. Awareness, I am here.
In my co-authored book on the garden itself, I called the garden a lively salon. And the reason for this was in the time of Anne Spencer, particularly in the early times of the garden, say up through 1920, there were no accommodations for African-American travelers in Lynchburg or the area. So the only place they had to stay was in the homes of residents of the city. Because Anne Spencer had been a Harlem Renaissance poet, she knew a lot of notables in the African-American Harlem Renaissance movement. And the list of people passing through here is amazing. Martin Luther King, Zora Neale Hurston, Marian Anderson, W.B. Du Bois. You name them, they came through here and participated in the Spencer Salon. I remember Chauncey Spencer, who was Anne Spencer's son, telling me that he remembers as a child Paul Robeson sitting on the stairs of the house giving an impromptu concert. I can imagine it probably shook the foundations of the house, and then moved out with Anne Spencer and friends into the garden to have conversations on art, civil rights, all kinds of things.
I'm gonna bear, Lord, bear we the world, yes. I'm gonna...
There were these satellites of Harlem all over the country, and Lynchburg happened to be one of those satellites that Anne Spencer created. I think about Langston Hughes walking through this garden, and W.E.B. Du Bois walking through this garden, and James Weldon Johnson walking through this garden. They had poetry readings, and they had music, and it was a really cultural landscape, a really cultural place to come to. My grandparents were big party people. They had a big party here for Langston Hughes. They had over 150 people that weren't just in that house. You have to imagine when I'm reading this article, they're all out here in this garden as well. I think that for my grandmother, the cultural and the intellectual food was just as important as that vegetable garden coming out that back door. This garden is more than just flowers and trees and grass. It is a place, it's open to the public, sunrise to sunset, and we did that because of this cultural place that my grandparents created, and we wanted to continue that.
Bear the burden in the heat of the day.
The layout of the Anne Spencer Garden is very, very sophisticated. I remember the first time I saw it, and I thought, this is quite an impressive garden. It's a very linear site. It's about 125 feet by 45 feet. And Anne Spencer created a garden that is threaded on an axis that contains 4 garden rooms. The rose garden has its own particular qualities. The lovely fragrance of the roses, the bird song that you begin to pick up as you walk into the garden. And then you pass through a gateway into where I'm sitting now, which is the cottage garden. There's a real feeling of intimacy about this garden. And of course, the cottage is where Anne Spencer wrote a lot of her poetry. And the window looks right down the main axis of the garden itself. The next garden, which is between the pergola and a grape arbor, is called the Arbor Garden, and it is wall-to-wall flowers. It's just an explosion of color. And then finally, one passes into what's called the Pond Garden. This is my favorite space in the garden. It's very serene. It centers on a small pond. It has tall evergreens around it, which gives it a very strong sense of enclosure and shelter. And you can just look up the full axis of the garden to the house. And I think this is the most serene and contemplative part of the garden itself. What's interesting about this garden also is that it's made of recycled architectural elements, probably from demolished houses in Lynchburg. Even though we're in a very rather dense neighborhood, it feels like you're miles away in a totally different realm.
Chauncey Spencer, Anne Spencer's son, had called to please come and look at his mother's garden because he wanted it to look like it did when Mother was there. Condition of the garden was very overgrown. There were paths still evident. There were no structures. There were no pergolas or arbors. It was quite a mess, actually. Historic photographs were one of the main sources of information. I had to get out a magnifying glass on a lot of them. They were small, but I could see that it was nothing but flowers everywhere. The Garden Conservancy was a great help to us in advising on the garden. This was maybe 10 years after we thought we had finished, and it was time to do some more work of some sort. And they sat and talked to us and made wonderful suggestions and then wrote it all up in a very good document for us to refer to. Made us feel real good, like we had not messed up too much. So I've been very thankful for the connection.
Some of the plants that are here in the restoration actually came from the Thomas Jefferson Center for Historic Plants, which is a program at Monticello that is involved with collecting, preserving, and propagating historic plant varieties all the way through the early 20th century. From the photos, we know that there were daylilies and phlox and peonies and bulbs, daffodils, and so forth, but also iris. There's some very interesting early 20th century iris varieties that we had in our collections that we were able to share with this garden. What makes this garden authentic is that you still have elements, early plants, the architectural features of the garden, the fencing, the walkways. I think those elements make it quite important and reflective of what is authentic about her.
One of the great joys of this garden has been what was Anne Spencer's that has survived. Now, there were some things that we purposely saved, like the roses and the bulbs, but there are other things that have just popped up everywhere. And I just think, isn't that nice? She is still here, and these are things that she planted back, many years ago. Anne Spencer, to me, has become a close friend. I never knew her, but I feel like I know her so well. I know her from playing in her dirt.
These two houses, this was the main house, the Spencer house, the one on the corner. This was the Spencer house, of course, the Spencer family there. The next house down, there was another one over in the next block, and we had two on this side. The historic district was designated in 2006. Out of the 7 historical districts in the city of Lynchburg, this is the smallest one of only 2 blocks, and we have the most markers of any historical district in the state of Virginia. And it's the most known out of all the 7 districts, 7 historical spots in Lynchburg, simply because of the people that made this historic district as opposed to the architecture in the other 6, okay? That's what makes these 2 blocks so special, the people.
It is so very important to have the Ann Spencer House and Garden as the only national historic landmark in our city, because to the African American community, she was such a connector. I think for me, it's the roots and Ann Spencer being so deep in the community, in the heart of the city. And she chose to live here. She chose to invest her time, her energy, her talents here. And so that is a part of the roots of this neighborhood. The fact that she toiled her hands in this garden, she turned over the dirt, she planted seeds of growth here. I think she was thinking like that for the entire community and neighborhood, and that's why it has sustained itself. And with Sean here, it has been wonderful, because to have a family member continue that heritage, that legacy, and that passion, it just makes the whole community thrive. This was an African American community where the neighbors, the residents, owned their homes. They invested in properties and land and what to pass on to family members. And so it was really built around the community of families, the community of investors. And they were some of the first investors in our neighborhoods and our cities. Throughout the years, too, there's so many influencers of African American life that lived right on this street.
Absolutely.
Longtime principal, Mr. C, Pauline Maloney, and they were integral in the Paul Laurence Dunbar High School years, predominantly African American high school. Arthur Ashe and Althea Gibson played tennis down the street. Dr. Walter Johnson helped train them in the tennis sport. So the restoration of this area is very rich for so many reasons. And this is just an integral part of the life of the neighborhood.
It's so rare to tour a historic Black neighborhood that sits within this historic district with a level of authenticity. And to see these intact houses and landscapes, they tell a collective story about the Black experience here in Lynchburg. And it's critically important, given the loss of African American historic places across the country for various reasons, whether it's racial and cultural displacement, the outmigration of African Americans from the South to other parts of the nation, to be able to have something that still stands to tell a neighborhood story. And most importantly, a story about the Black middle class experience, which is one that is rarely interpreted in American history.
We have a house museum that is 98% original. At the time, it was 100% original. The 2% that is no longer in this house museum is now held at the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library. And so it was just those 2 years after my grandmother's death that this becomes a Virginia historic landmark on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a big, big deal. I try to keep as much original as I can. So you'll have original things like this wallpaper, and of course the mirrors and everything else that's in this room is original. But the original wallpaper that was in this room just came off the walls, and so we treated it with paint. I consider this to kind of be like a bohemian style. It's like all of these colors and mix of patterns. I see that also in my grandmother's dress. You'll see it also in their garden. Sometimes we talk about, whether the house was inspired by the garden or the garden was inspired by the house. You just see this, this connection between the two. But, Edward he was a creative. You have to really give that to him. A lot of people only consider Anne Spencer to be the creative, but she married a creative. Neither one of them are going to be put into a box. Their creativity is beyond that, and not afraid to go beyond that and to try things different that wasn't the norm in the early 1900s. I think that is pretty remarkable that Anne Spencer is on a postal stamp, because Edward was the one who worked for the United States Postal Service, and he worked so hard to provide for his family, and to take the back seat. And here she is, uplifted. He's uplifted her to the postal stamp. Really, he has done that. And the other thing which is really cool about this postal stamp, is that she is joined with other people that she knew, Schomburg and Lawson and Elaine Locke. Were all people who were writers and poets.
I've learned a lot about Anne Spencer from working in her archives and, helping researchers find material in her archives. In fact, she's so multidimensional. She was a teacher, librarian, poet. She's a wife, a mother, civil rights activist. It's hard to just actually pigeonhole her into one role, because there is so much to her. And we're very fortunate too that the archives allow us to see those different sides of her as well. And some of the things that we have in the Anne Spencer archives include manuscript versions of her poems, things written in her own handwriting. We have photographs of her family members, of the house, of the garden. There are many different ways to sort of juxtapose and put her collection in conversation with other materials that we have. We have amazing literary collections, particularly first editions of writers in the Harlem Renaissance. And seeing her works often in those anthologies, knowing she had relationships with some of those authors, is very helpful to get a sense of, where she fits in with that cultural movement of the time.
And then that's when you see her writing kind of going off.
And angles.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And she's writing over stuff. But this is some of her early, definitely.
Making archival collections available to everyone is a fundamental part of our mission. And particularly the papers of someone like Anne Spencer, a figure of this incredible moment of flourishing in the 20th century. There are so many different incredible stories to be found. One story is the relationship between the act of gardening and the act of writing poetry, which for Anne Spencer are completely blended. And you see that not just in the fact that the poems are often written on seed catalogs or other related material, or that the content of the poems are often about gardens, but I think often you see that the process of poems for Anne Spencer is a lot like the process of gardening. It's ongoing. It's never done. Anyone who's a gardener knows there is no such thing as a completed garden. And for a lot of Anne Spencer's work, there's no completed poem, and there was no goal of a completed poem. In the archive, you can track these projects, these poems that she worked on for a very, very long time. And in some ways, it feels to me as though the work of the garden and the work of the poetry are in sync.
There's a real mix in curating of trying to understand the past in the present, but also think about the future, because you're building a collection that one's descendants might see. You're thinking about legacy. And I think legacy is what joins this museum and other archives, and especially those Black legacy museums. It's so important for us to stay connected to those legacy museums and spaces like the Schomburg or the Ann Spencer House and Gardens, because I think it really helps us think about the ways that Black history is found everywhere, and it is vibrant and evergreen, but it also requires tending to, much like a garden. That gardening part of that tradition is really tied to these other parts, to the music, which wasn't always meant to be recorded. It was oral and went away, but it was also remembered and carried. So I think both about how these things are fragile and kind of ephemeral, but also that they're sustaining and kind of tough. There's a kind of rootedness to Black culture that I think is important to keep in mind.
Many ways, I think, in the U.S. historic preservation movement, the nation thinks that we preserve only physical buildings that tell stories about American history, but in essence, we also are advocating for the preservation of cultural landscapes and all of its diversity. I think that we're missing the kind of gardening record and direct connection to African American history. And I think this is the beautiful opportunity in this moment, is beginning to shift our nation's understanding of what is worthy of preservation.
It is the only preserved house and garden of an African American poet in the country. It's an extremely rare historic site. Beyond that, it's a garden that is involved in the life of this community. It's embedded in the civic life of Lynchburg. It annually hosts the Ann Spencer Poetry Contest. It is an active supporter and participant in the Pierce Street Renaissance Festival. Just the life of Ann Spencer herself is an inspiration.
There are so few Black American women recognized in gardening history, let alone civil rights. In essence, our revolutionary act at this moment in historic preservation is filling these gaps in history, and most importantly, uplifting contributions and stories like Ann Spencer's and other Black women.
I think she would be really proud of all of us, even of us just being here today and doing this film on her garden. I don't think they ever had any idea. They never created this to be that. They were living their lives, and they were doing what they could to better their community, to better themselves, and to better their families. And they certainly have done that. And we have this rich historic site, national historic site, that is a small little picture of African American life in the 1920s, 30s, 40s.
As Frank Cabot, our founder, said, in many cases, the creation of a garden is an effort to create a greater perfection. And I think that Ann Spencer, who was doubly marginalized, first of all, by being an African American, and secondly, by being an African American woman, was creating her idea of an ideal world in her garden.
I am pleased to see how the Garden Conservancy is fulfilling its mission to tell the full history of American gardening. And like us at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, we're moving beyond just high-style architecture or gardens designed by prominent landscape architects. And it's critically important that we uplift and that we recognize that the informal garden or the vernacular building or vernacular garden, that they are worthy of being preserved. Their story matters. This place matters. This landscape matters. And we believe that this historic place must stand in perpetuity to tell this important American story.
There's not one story that gardens tell. There's not one kind of American garden. And so the Ann Spencer Garden becomes extraordinarily important in helping us to tell a broad range and a diverse range of gardening stories. I think that it's a remarkable document and a remarkable survival, and maybe one of the most important gardens in the United States because of that.